You might recognize this building. It's a symbol of Spain. And this one, a jewel of Morocco. Millions of people walk beneath these structures every year, but almost no one knows the story of the Saharan warriors who made them possible. Imagine an empire born from the sand, an empire that ran on fervent faith and literal rivers of gold. They answered a desperate call from Europe, crossed the sea, and forged a dominion that stretched from the heart of Africa to the hills of Spain. They were one of the most powerful forces of their time, and yet today, they're almost completely forgotten. This is the lost legacy of the Almoravid Dynasty, the Sahara's forgotten empire. So, how does an empire rise from one of the most inhospitable places on earth? First, you have to change how you see the Sahara. In the 11th century, this wasn't an empty wasteland. It was a superhighway of commerce, a network of ancient trade routes that acted as the arteries for an entire continent. For centuries, camel caravans had trekked across this ocean of sand, carrying salt and textiles south, and returning with ivory, slaves, and most importantly, gold. The men who controlled these routes held the keys to incredible wealth and power. This was the world of the Sanhaja, a fierce confederation of Berber tribes. These nomads were masters of the desert, their lives dictated by the seasons. They had converted to Islam centuries before, but their faith was often mixed with older folk traditions. And, politically, they were fractured. Rival clans like the Lamtuna, the Gudala, and the Masufa were loyal to their kin, not to any unified state. This division had cost them dearly. They lost control of the most important gateways of the trans-Saharan trade. The market city of Sijamasa in the north, and the vital hub of Autogast in the south. The desire to reclaim their dominance was a fire waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in the form of a man named Abdallah ibn Yassin, a Berber theologian. Ibn Yassin was a Puritan, a reformer who had studied a strict orthodox version of Sunni Islam. Around the year 1040, he was invited back to his homeland by a Sanhaja chief who wanted to deepen his people's faith. Ibn Yassin was uncompromising. He preached a return to the purest form of Islam, a doctrine that stripped away tribal customs and demanded total obedience to religious law. He saw tribalism itself as the enemy, an obstacle to creating a single, unified community of believers. At first, his rigid message was rejected. The Gudala tribe found his teachings too extreme, revolted, and drove him into exile. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Retreating with his most devoted followers, Ibn Yassin set up a Rabuta fortified religious compound, part monastery, part military fortress. Here, in this isolated sanctuary, a new movement was born. They called themselves the Almorabitan, the people of the ribbit, or those who are bound together. History would know them as the Almoravids. Ibn Yassin's vision was simple but powerful. Unite the Berber tribes under the banner of a single, purified faith, and use that unity to impose their will on the world through holy war. The simmering anger of the Sanhaja now had a divine purpose. The spark had found dry tinder, and the desert was about to catch fire. The Almoravid movement was the perfect storm of religious zeal and military necessity. Abdallah ibn Yassin was its spiritual heart, but its muscle came from the leaders of the Lamtuna tribe. First, Yahya ibn Umar, and after his death, his brother Abu Bakr ibn Umar. Together, they transformed a band of followers into a disciplined and terrifying army. Their first targets weren't random. They were strategic, designed to grab the economic lifeblood of the Sahara. In 1053, they struck. The Almoravid warriors, hardened by the desert and united by faith, stormed the great northern trading city of Sit. Its ruler was killed, and the city was theirs. Almost at the same time, they marched south and captured Autogast, the gateway to the goldfields of West Africa. In one swift campaign, the Almoravids had seized both ends of the most lucrative highway in the world. The rivers of gold now flowed straight to them. With their economic base secure, the conquests picked up speed. They pushed north from the desert into the fertile lands of modern-day Morocco. Their campaign was relentless. It was during this push that the movement's founder, Abdallah ibn Yassin, was killed in battle while fighting a rebellious tribe. But the movement he created was now too powerful to fail. Full military command fell to Abu Bakr ibn Umar, who just kept advancing. Around 1070, a decision was made that would change North African history forever. The Almoravids, a people of the desert, needed a capital. They chose a dusty, sun-baked plain and founded the city of Marrakesh. Out of nothing, an imperial city began to rise, destined to become one of the great cultural centers of the Islamic world. It was also around this time that one of the most important figures in the dynasty's history came to the forefront, Yusuf ibn Tashfin. A cousin of the commander, Abu Bakr ibn Tashfin, was put in charge of the armies in Morocco, while Abu Bakr returned to the Sahara to crush a rebellion. It was supposed to be a temporary gig, but Ibn Tashfin was a brilliant general and an even better politician. He was so effective, so popular, and so successful that when Abu Bakr finally returned, he had to face the new reality. In a stunning act of political realism, Abu Bakr acknowledged his cousin's power, gave up his own command, and returned to the desert, leaving Yusuf ibn Tashfin as the undisputed ruler of the empire. Under Yusuf's command, the rest of the North African puzzle fell into place. He was a master strategist and a deeply religious leader who inspired incredible loyalty. He captured the city of Fez around 1070, though some sources suggest it may have been as late as 1075, and brought all of modern-day Morocco under his control. By 1082, his empire stretched east to Algiers, uniting the Maghreb Northwest Africa under a single Berber power for the first time. Yusuf ibn Tashfin never called himself Caliph, the supreme leader of all Muslims. Instead, he took the title Amir al-Muslim, commander of the Muslims, formally recognizing the spiritual authority of the distant Caliph in Baghdad, while acting as the absolute king of his own vast empire. From a small religious sect in the desert, the Almoravids had become the masters of North Africa. They controlled the gold, commanded a mighty army, and had a capital that grew grander by the day. But their biggest test, and their most lasting legacy, was waiting just across a narrow strait of water in Europe. By the late 11th century, Muslim Spain al-Andalus was a ghost of its former self. The great Caliphate of Córdoba had shattered, breaking into a bunch of small, competing kingdoms called tifas. These little states, based in cities like Seville and Granada, were rich and cultured, but militarily, were weak. They spent as much time fighting each other as they did their real enemy to the north, the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Aragon. That enemy was led by the ambitious king, Alfonso VI of Castile. Pushing south in what would become known as the Reconquista, Alfonso's armies were unstoppable. In 1085, he won a huge victory. The capture of the ancient city of Toledo, deep in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. The fall of Toledo sent a shockwave across the Muslim world. Panicked and facing total defeat, the Tifa kings knew they couldn't stop Alfonso alone. In their desperation, they looked south to the new power from the Sahara. Al-Mutamit, the ruler of Seville, swallowed his fear of the austere Almoravids and sent a desperate plea for help to Yusuf ibn Tashfin. It was a massive gamble. As one of his advisors famously warned, he'd rather be a camel driver in Africa than a swineherder in Castile. Yusuf ibn Tashfin answered the call. In 1086, he ferried his army across the Strait of Gibraltar. These weren't the polished soldiers of Al-Andalus. They were desert-hardened warriors, a terrifying force of Berber horsemen and foot soldiers, including an elite guard of black African soldiers, armed with long javelins and huge shields. This was a clash of worlds. The rugged, puritanical power of Africa arriving to save the sophisticated, decadent courts of Europe. Alfonso VI, cocky after his victory at Toledo, met the challenge head-on. He gathered his army of Castilian knights, considered some of the best in Christendom, and marched south. The two armies met in 1086 on a plain near Badajoz, in a battle that would become known as Sagrajas or Alzalaka in Arabic. Before the fight, Yusuf offered Alfonso three choices: convert to Islam, pay tribute, or face him in battle. Alfonso chose battle. The fighting started at dawn. At first, the Andalusian forces took the brunt of the Castilian charge and started to break, but Yusuf was holding his main force back. As the battle raged, he unleashed his divisions in a devastating pincer movement. The turning point came when he ordered his elite African guard to charge, shattering the Christian cavalry. Alfonso's army was surrounded and crushed. The king himself was badly wounded in the thigh, an injury that left him with a limp for life. The Christian army was annihilated. The ground was said to be so slick with blood that it was called Al-Zalakatha. Slippery ground. The victory was absolute. Sagrajas stopped the Christian advance for a generation and saved Muslim Spain. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was hailed as a hero, but having saved the Tifa kings, he now saw them for what they were: weak, divided, and unreliable. He returned to Spain in 1090, but his time not as a savior, but as a conqueror. One by one, he deposed the very kings who had invited him, accusing them of being bad Muslims and corrupt leaders. The kingdoms of Granada, Seville, and others were swallowed into his empire. By 1094, Yusuf had united almost all of Muslim Spain with his North African lands. For the first time, a single empire stretched from the Sahara to the heart of Spain, all ruled from Marrakesh. The Tifa king's desperate gamble had saved Al-Andalus from the Christians, only to hand it over to a new, more powerful master. The camel drivers had arrived, and now they were in charge. With 2 continents under their control, the Almoravids commanded an empire of incredible wealth. Their power was built on African gold and the Islamic faith. By conquering Sijamasa and Odagast, they had gained a near monopoly on the trans-Saharan gold trade. Gold dust, mined in West Africa, flowed north through their territory, making the empire fantastically rich. And this wasn't just abstract wealth. The Almoravids minted huge quantities of high-purity gold coins called Almoravid dinars. These coins became the dominant currency of the era, respected across the Mediterranean and even in Christian Europe. In fact, the influence was so deep that the Spanish word for mane meravithi comes directly from Almoravid. This river of gold paid for their massive armies and funded their ambitious building projects. Their control of trade also had a devastating impact on the powers to their south. The Almoravid expansion is often seen as a major reason for the decline of the Great Ghana Empire. By taking over its key trading partners and redirecting commerce, the Almoravids helped weaken Ghana, contributing to its eventual collapse. Culturally, the Almoravids were shaped by their puritanical origins. They followed the Maliki school, a strict interpretation of Islamic law, and at first, they looked down on the decorative art they found in Ola. Their philosophy was to reject excess and focus on function and faith. You can see this in their architecture. The Almoravids were great builders, but their style was sober and practical, especially compared to the dynasties that came before or after them. They built great mosques in cities like Algiers and Tlemcen and massively expanded the famous Karawiyan Mosque in Fez. Their buildings are known for powerful, clean lines, huge defensive walls, and the horseshoe arch, which would become a signature of the region's architecture. And yet, even these tough desert warriors couldn't resist the beauty of Andalusia. Over time, their style began to evolve. They started to incorporate more decorative elements from Spanish artisans, spreading Andalusian art into North Africa, and creating a unique new style. They introduced innovations like muqarnas, the complex, honeycomb-like carvings, used to create stunning domes, some of the earliest examples in the Western Islamic world. One of the few surviving jewels from their own capital is the Almoravid Kuba in Marrakesh. It's a small, modest building from the outside, but its interior reveals a breathtakingly ornate dome, a masterpiece of carved stucco and intricate arches that shows just how far their art had come. They were also masters of engineering, building sophisticated underground irrigation systems, called kitara, to bring water to their cities, an essential skill for a dynasty born in the desert. The Almoravid period created a single cultural and economic zone from Spain to the Sahara. Scholars, artists, and merchants traveled freely between Marrakesh and Seville, Córdoba and Fez. The legacy of the Almoravids was being written in gold and carved in stone, a testament to an empire that had bridged two worlds. But even at the height of their power, the seeds of their destruction were already being planted. Empires don't last forever. The Almoravid Dynasty, which rose so quickly, began to fall apart for reasons common to so many great powers. The religious fire that had powered their rise started to fade. The second and third generations of rulers weren't the tough, ascetic warriors who came out of the desert. They were princes born in palaces in Marrakesh and Seville, surrounded by the luxury their grandfathers had scorned. The strict ideology that had united them began to soften, and so did the discipline of their armies. Their giant empire was also a weakness. They were overstretched, fighting a constant, grinding war on two fronts. In Spain, the Christian kingdoms bounced back from the shock of Sagrajas and started pushing south again. In 1118, the crucial city of Zaragoza fell, a major blow to their northern defenses. Keeping soldiers all over Spain was a constant drain on their money and manpower. But the mortal threat didn't come from the Christians. It came, once again, from the south, from the same Berber heartlands that had birthed the Almoravids themselves. A new religious movement was rising. They were called the Almohads, which means the Unitarians. The Almohad movement was started by a man named Ibn Tumort, a religious scholar from the mountains. Just like Abdallah ibn Yasin before him, Ibn Tumort was a charismatic and uncompromising reformer, but his doctrine was even stricter. He declared himself the Mahdi, a prophesied redeemer, and accused the Almoravids of falling into religious error and decadence. He claimed they had betrayed pure Islam. History was repeating itself, but this time with a terrifying intensity. The Almohads were a direct challenge to the Almoravids' legitimacy, not just as rulers, but as Muslims. Starting in the 1120s, they launched a holy war from the mountains against the very empire that was founded on the exact same principle a century earlier. The war between them was brutal. The Almohads, led by Ibn Tumort and his brilliant successor, Abd al-Mumin, were just as fervent as the first Almoravid warriors had been. The Almoravid state, meanwhile, was weak and divided. Their armies suffered a series of devastating defeats. The Almoravid ruler, Tashfin ibn Ali, died in 1145 after falling off a cliff while fleeing a battle. The end came in 1147. After a long siege, the Almohad army broke through the walls of Marrakesh, the imperial capital. Their city fell, and the last Almoravid ruler, a young boy named Ishaq ibn Ali, was executed. The Almoravid dynasty was wiped out. After a century of power, the empire forged in the Sahara was overthrown by a new force from the mountains. The cycle had turned. The Almoravids, once the zealous reformers, had become the corrupt establishment, swept away by a new wave of puritanical fury. So why is this mighty empire, a power that dominated two continents and rewrote European history, been so forgotten? Why do we remember Yusuf ibn Tashfin and the Battle of Sagrajas like we do William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings, which happened just 20 years apart? Part of the reason is that their successors, the Almohads, actively tried to erase their legacy. The Almohads built grander mosques, often right on top of Almoravid foundations, and wrote their own version of history. In Spain, the Reconquista eventually succeeded, and the Christian rulers who came after had little reason to preserve the memory of their Muslim enemies. The Almoravid story was simply written over. They were also a transitional power. They rose and fell in a single, turbulent, sensuous, brilliant, but brief flash. In the long history of the region, you can think of them as a bridge, a channel through which art, ideas, and culture flowed from Andalusia into North Africa, setting the stage for the great Moroccan dynasties that followed. Their influence is baked into the foundations of later, more famous structures, like the Giralda in Seville, which was built by the Almohads, who were themselves heavily influenced by Almoravid design. And yet, their impact was profound. They were the first to truly unify the Maghreb. They created the gold standard of their age, and for a critical moment, they saved Muslim Spain, changing the timeline of the Reconquista and ensuring that Andalusian culture would survive for another 2 centuries. They were the architects of Marrakesh, and left their mark on cities like Fez and Tlemcen. The Almoravid legacy isn't lost because it disappeared. It's lost because it was absorbed. It became so fundamental to the DNA of both Morocco and Spain that it is often mistaken for the work of others, or just seen as part of the landscape. They are the forgotten empire whose monuments we still admire, whose economic influence echoes in our language, and whose story is a powerful reminder of how even the mightiest powers can be swallowed by the sands of time. A dynasty of desert warriors who crossed the sea, built an empire of gold, and left a legacy hidden in plain sight. If you loved this journey into the Sahara's forgotten empire, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories from the lost chapters of history. Like this video to help us unearth more incredible narratives, and let us know in the comments which forgotten empire you think we should explore next. Thanks for watching.